professor Velde è una delle massime autorità sui minerali argillosi, vuole interfacciare su quelli che possono essere i cambiamenti climatici e anche le trasmigrazioni di massa avvenute durante il Neolitico, che hanno avuto, secondo l'interpretazione del professor Velde, una fortissima connessione con quelle che sono le attività.
The subject now.
Allora, il soggetto della conferenza è l'importanza della relazione che esiste tra le piante e i processi chimici e mineralogici che avvengono nel suolo. In pratica le piante in qualche modo influenzano la chimica e la mineralogia dei suoli. Fondamentalmente dobbiamo immaginare due tipologie di piante: le piante erbacee, come ad esempio le graminacee, e gli alberi, quindi le foreste. I due gruppi crescono su suoli differenti, ma soprattutto rendono i suoli e la chimica di questi suoli differente. Tant'è vero che poi i due tipi di piante sono piante antagoniste. L'una non può vivere sui suoli prodotti dall'altra, e infatti nel periodo neolitico, in seguito ai cambiamenti climatici, le popolazioni che praticavano l'agricoltura furono costrette dalla siccità a muoversi dalle zone più a sud alle zone più a nord. Quindi le zone più a sud, dove c'erano appunto le graminacee, le erbacee, dove loro coltivavano, le zone più a nord dove trovarono le foreste, e dovettero chiaramente addomesticare questi suoli per poterli coltivare. E nonostante non avessero studiato, sfruttarono due caratteristiche tipiche, diciamo, dell'agricoltore. Uno, allevare animali domestici, le cui deiezioni venivano poi distribuite nei suoli, incrementando il contenuto di sostanze organiche e migliorando le proprietà chimiche. E due, tagliavano gli alberi, li bruciavano e utilizzavano le ceneri di questi alberi per poter migliorare la fertilità dei suoli.
Tutti, se ci accomodiamo, chi ha la possibilità di farlo. Innanzitutto benvenuti a questa giornata dedicata alle Distinguished Lecture in Earth Science, organizzata dal Dipartimento di Scienze della Terra. Siamo ospitati in una sede alquanto prestigiosa, tutti quanti dovreste già conoscere questa sede, se non la conoscete è un'ottima occasione per visitarla, e l'occasione appunto è particolarmente importante perché l'ospite che oggi ci farà questa relazione è il professor Bruce Velde. Per chi non lo conoscesse, io mi sono appuntato un po' di notizie bibliografiche. Il professor Bruce Velde è uno dei massimi esperti internazionali di minerali argillosi e mineralogia geochimica dei suoli, autore di oltre 200 pubblicazioni scientifiche di importanti monografie. La sua storia è iniziata all'Università del Montana, dove si è laureato, e poi successivamente ha conseguito il dottorato di ricerca all'Università dell'Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Attualmente è direttore di ricerca emerito del Consiglio nazionale delle ricerche in Francia, del Dipartimento di Geoscienze dell'École Normale Supérieure di Perugia. E diciamo, per quanto mi riguarda, la mia conoscenza del professor Velde è legata fondamentalmente a questo libro, che è il libro sul quale ho iniziato a approcciare anche i miei studi sui minerali argillosi, Origin and Mineralogy of Clays. Come ho avuto modo di parlare con il professore Velde, ho capito che questa viene considerata un poco come la mineralogia delle argille del passato, e sono particolarmente contento del fatto che oggi il professor Velde invece ci delineerà quali possono essere gli sviluppi futuri dello studio delle argille per quanto riguarda le relazioni tra il suolo, le rocce e tutto quello che ha guidato anche degli importanti momenti storici, come per esempio la transizione neolitica di circa 7000 anni fa. A questo punto io cederei la parola al professor Velde, e se dopo ci sono delle domande, delle cose che volete chiedere a lui, sono sicuramente ben accette. Vi passo la parola al professor Velde.
Thank you. You can hear me all right?
Yes.
It's not too loud?
No.
Okay. I hate these. Okay, the subject today is in fact one about symbiosis. And it's reflected in the history of the Neolithic agricultural movement and Neolithization in Europe. But in fact, the basis of the whole thing is a symbiotic relationship between plants and the soils that they are in, and how one reacts with the other one to form an equilibrium. And then something comes along to perturb the equilibrium, which is man. It's all messed up. It changes things, tries to understand things, so forth and so on. So I would like to explain this, the reasons, in fact, how this evolved, and then at the very end, we'll talk a little bit about geology and about the unfortunate effects of post-war industrialization in Europe. So, the use of plants to feed people is relatively recent. It's what's called the Neolithic. And this occurred in the Middle East or Near East, along the Mediterranean, Palestinian area, and into the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. It also occurred roughly at the same time in China, and it also occurred roughly at the same time in Southeast Asia, in the islands and so forth. Depending upon where the people were, what they grew and how they did it was different, and the evolution of things was different. So we will look at the European one, which became European. The Middle East is I don't know what, and then we'll try to explain why this and how this happened. So the Neolithic agriculture was based upon using plants from the steppes, that is graminae, grasses, wheat, oats, corn, lentils, things like that, that were wild plants that had been picked up like that by people, but they figured out how to take the seeds, plant them, and grow and produce much more. This was well adapted because the climate was what it was supposed to be. They grew them in the steppes along the rivers where there was water present, but the soils were at the same time in the steppes because of the eroded materials and so forth. So it was an easy transition. It was a relatively easy thing to do. So they grew the plants as they could, and at the same time, a number of other agricultural progresses were made, which in fact were extremely important. So they grew the plants. This increased the amount of foodstuff that was available. Instead of having 5 kids and 3 of them dying right away, they could have 6 and all 6 survived. The population increased amazingly. At the same time, they domesticated animals, which gave them meat. They didn't have to go hunt. They didn't have to send the man out going around like this and shooting at things like that. They could do it next to the house. And in fact, it was extremely important. They used small animals like sheep and goats. And in fact, the cattle were some of the last animals to be domesticated. At the same time, they developed polished stone as axe heads, which gave them the possibility of hitting very hard on wood. Whereas if you have a flake stone, which was just for arrowheads and things like that, it's very fragile. It will break if you hit it on a trunk. But the polished axe head allowed them to cut down trees and to manipulate the wood. It was extremely important. And another thing, probably more important, was, in fact, the use of ceramics. They developed ceramics, which could be used to store the grain. But much, much more important, the ceramics were used for cooking. So they transformed this raw food by cooking it, and this increases the food value, nutritive content by up to 40%. Don't tell that to the vegans. They're still eating this stuff. You know? But cooked food is far, far, far more nutritive. So the ceramic business, and then having this material available, of course, was extremely important. So these axe heads could be used for cutting down trees, also for hitting the hard earth, for digging in the earth, and using it as an agricultural tool to break up the hard clods. It's easier for the plants the seeds to grow, the small roots that penetrate, so forth and so on. The beginning of agriculture and farming as such. And it runs, that's the way things go. We don't want to make pictures of Neolithic people milking cows, but this is Egypt. And you can see that it became a very common thing. Now, in order for that to happen, you don't want the animals to be roaming around for 15, 20 kilometers around in the woods. You want them to be near the house. This is particularly the case for goats, which are difficult to get a hold of. If they're 20 kilometers away, how are you going to get them to milk them? Kind of stuff, and sheep. So that the animals tend to be around the dwellings. Now, this is a problem I haven't solved yet. I'll get to it one of these days. Is that the animals, the structure of houses, but they never tell us where the fields were, where the enclosures were. They have to have been there because you dig a hole in the ground to put a post in it. But if it was not for a house, the archaeologists don't care and they'll look at it. So we got to get a look on this stuff. But most likely, the animals were not very far away. And so what's important about them? Because they come around, this produces manure that can enter to a field where you're growing these crops. And manure is very, very useful as a nutrient for these steppe plants, the graminae, things like that. Very important, as everybody knows, until the invention of ammonium nitrate fertilizers. So one thing that I found to be extremely interesting was the differences in the amount of milk that's produced in different animals. The little ones give a lot more milk, the goat and the sheep, than the cow or the horse, particularly the goat is extremely important. This is probably why France, which is a very common nation, produces enormous quantities of goat cheese. Not more than the animal. And goat cheese is still extremely used. It's a very important type of cheese is very much in France. But there's a big difference between the amount of milk that comes out and it can be used. Then again, we have to calculate and see how much meat there is compared to the amount that the animals eat. But that's another problem. So, when archaeologists are looking at these pots, things that have been the ceramics on the sites, what they find is a thing like this. It's a little pot fed with holes in it. This is used to take the milk, they coagulate it with the stomach of an animal, coagulates it, they put it in there, the water is out, you're making cheese with that. You can take that material, mature it, and it becomes cheese. So this is a signal that this process was important, and we find that frequently in the Neolithic, all across the areas where the Neolithization occurred. Now, that was done in the villages, just to show you that things haven't changed all that much. These are 19th century pottery objects we found near our country house in western France, different ways to make cheese. It depends upon the animal, how you're treating the milk, so forth and so on, many holes, fewer holes, so forth and so on. But the system is still exactly the same thing, 11,000 years. Okay, we're still doing it. The other thing, which was very important, was a polished stone. This is a flat stone that had been cut in the ground and polished, and another one that was rounded out and polished. This can be used to crush the grains, to break them. This makes flour, and this flour is then cooked, and the nutritive value increases 40%. That's the way you make tortilla or pizza crust, depending upon where you are. It's a very old system, but it is extremely useful and has done for quite some time. So things were going along pretty well. A couple thousand years, 2,000 years. And then after 9,000 to about 8,000, the climate started to change. These people who were living on the steppes found that it rained less. Temperatures were increasing without smoking, without using automobiles or whatever, the temperature increased. But at the same time, further north in Europe, there was a boreal period where it rained more often, and in fact this encouraged forest growth. So on the one hand, you were losing the steppes, and to the north it was raining, you could grow crops, but you were creating forest and forest soils. Anyway, this was recorded in literature. The literature is, for us, or for me, the Old Testament. Because I'm not a Jewish origin, but it's Jewish history where they said, oh, things are getting bad. Eden is being destroyed. Eden was the slopes of the Tigris-Euphrates basin, where there were animals, where you could grow grain, so forth and so on, where trees grew, where apples were in the trees, and then this got dry. So they saw that and said, well, who could do a thing like that? Well, it can only be God. No, God's not as dumb as that. It was what? Okay. We head down there. So who changed the climate? It's in Genesis, it's written down, is that a woman wanted to have knowledge. So she went and ate this apple from this tree, and God said, out. I am going to destroy your former life, and Eden is destroyed. And it was the fault of a woman, not God. Of course. But the climate changed anyway. Eve didn't have too much to do with that. So, the only way you can get around that is to go where it rains. And where it rained, and they were seeing this quite rapidly, is from the Middle East, there in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. I won't mention the names of the countries that are there because they're going to be gone in a few years. But anyway, the way up was to go through Turkey first, and then into Greece, where it was raining more. The climate was becoming more convenient for growing things, but was increasing the amount of trees and the forest areas in those sectors. So, the obvious thing that had to be done was the people who were growing grasses in the steppes had to grow them in forest areas. So you say, oh, so what's the big deal? There was a big deal. So this is a schematic diagram of climate and rainfall and temperature and rainfall and how you shift from one to the other. But this is in a stable situation, whereas what was seen at that time was the overall change and it bifurcated somewhat. And it's not the same thing as we see now. But archaeologists have very, very good data on this climate change. They can tell you very, very carefully how much it changed and how rapidly it changed. But people who are meteorologists and environmentalists and so forth have not consulted the archaeologists, unfortunately. So, you say, okay, so what's the big deal? So on one side you have prairie soil, and at the surface you have the zone that's dominated by plant activity. Chemistry is dominated by plant activity. What one sees is you have a deposition of organic material. The soil is darker, is brown to black, so forth and so on. And some of the clays and some of the materials get washed down somewhat from the A horizon to B, which is below the roots. A horizon mainly means that most of the roots of the plants that are growing are in that horizon. Most plants, in the first 50 centimeters, is where about 80% of the roots are growing, even trees with varieties. So there's a strong activity of plant activity, interaction with the soils in that surface layer. And the prairie, the soils tend to have a pH that's above 7, maybe 8, 7, 8, which is typical. Whereas in the forest areas, the soil is acid. It's a pH of 3 to 4. So the pH is different, but also this acidity allows aluminum to dissolve and be put into solution. So the soils in the acid forest soils are rich in aluminum, and this is a hindrance to growing prairie plants. Prairie plants do not like this at all. So this is a synopsis of what we talk about when we talk about soil sequences. Basically, agronomists and other people talk about the rock zone. Then the rock gets transformed by interaction with water that's flowing through and eventually goes out into the rivers. And that's in the clay-rock interaction zone. But it doesn't have much to do with the organic material and the interaction with the surface dominated by the organic, by the plants. The further you go up, the more interaction there is with the plants and the more of a control there is by the plants. Now, different kind of rocks will give you different kind of base overall chemistry. You have a soil that's developed on a carbonate, it has a pH there towards 7 or 8, something like that. But if you have a soil that's developed on a granite, even down below, it tends to be acid. So the type of rock equally can favor whether you're going to have a forest or whether you can have a prairie. So the geology is also a very important factor in the overall structure, chemical structure of the soils. So, you say, why? What's going on? Why are you guys doing this? Okay. So you ever look and see a pine forest in the mountains, and lightning strikes, and it burns. Trees burn, whatever, and it takes them about 8 or 9 years to grow back. But the meadow, the prairie, and the mountain next to the forest, it burns, it grows back in a year. It goes, it's going to get into the forest. Oh, the trees are not there anymore, I'm going to get in. And the forest says, nah, the heavier you are, it's acid. I poisoned the soil so you cannot get me. It's a self-defense mechanism, I believe. This has not been verified by scientists at the higher levels. But it's very clear that there's an antagonism between forest and soil, but also in a way that the forest regenerates much more slowly, and the plants of the prairies can go back in and take over and in fact snuff out the trees. So that's the story. You'll be invaded by the grasses, and the trees want to avoid that. So they develop these defense mechanisms whereby they can continue their inheritance and so forth and so on. And this is very typical of plants. Not like people who kill each other at the drop of a hat. We get rid of that stuff. So this is a very structured kind of a system, and it's a very important thing when you're considering agriculture. And this is the thing, the low pH is very antagonistic to the grasses, and it cuts down their productivity enormously. They don't grow very well. And the high aluminum solutions create a new kind of clay mineral in the forest soils, which is what we call vermiculite or hydroxy interlayered mineral. But it maintains this aluminum within the clay mineral itself. It can be released throughout the year or after several a constant resource of poison for the grasses. So this is a long-term structural situation. So here are these Neolithic people, and they gotta grow their grass in these poison forest soils. What do? When you cut down the trees with your stone axes, you burn the wood, because in a forest when it burns, most of the wood is standing up. It doesn't get back into the soil. They cut the trees down, they burn them to make ashes, and these ashes are thrown out, and they release potassium and calcium, which are hydroxides, which change the pH. Pretty neat, you know? So we've cut down the trees, we've changed the pH some, and then in order to maintain this as being a non-forest area, you put it in pasture. Animals eat the tree shoots if they're growing up. The manure is there to encourage the growth of ground, and it increases the fertility of the soils for the grasses eventually. At the same time, you have another source, a more strong source of transformation, which is the manure from the animals that are kept around the houses. This can be split on the field too during this grazing period, and you're again changing the soil, increasing the potassium as well as the ammonium content and changing the pH. If you consider our modern day fertilizer systems, it's NKP, ammonium, potassium, and phosphorus. They got 2 out of 3. It's not bad. So basically what they were doing, when they cut down the trees, burn them, graze the land, and so forth and so on, where they were changing the soil chemistry from a forest soil instead of a stone. So, this is where the things were started. And at the time of the Neolithic in Asia, the red part is where the Neolithic invasion was done. The Middle East was there. And we see that the forest is covering green, put everything up above. So if the people from the Middle East were going to go somewhere, they had to go into the forest. There was nothing they could do with it. So they did. They got their rucksacks, and they got some plastic in it so it didn't get wet. They carried it in the back, and they climbed up over the mountains, and they went out. And the Neolithization, that is the development of agriculture, spread across around the Mediterranean and north of it through Greece and Eastern Europe, around the Alps, and then ended up in France and England and so forth and so on. Now, you say, okay, but it took quite some time, actually. And in fact, it ended up in France, see if I can figure that out. Yeah, here it was about 4000 BC when the Neolithization occurred. So you say, ooh, it took a long time. It was 1 kilometer a year. The change, dramatic change from hunting and food gathering societies to sedentary agricultural societies, it advanced 1 kilometer a year on average, but continuing. This was not Genghis Khan or anything like that, but probably guys talking on the fence.
Abbiamo qualche domanda, qualcuno delle curiosità? Grazie. Io ho qualche domanda, quelle vengono per dopo, per Paola. Everything is clear, of course, as usual.
Simple-minded. Okay, I thank you very much for having me here in this building that represents so much to me. This is real science. The real collections of the objects that people have spent years looking for, finding, describing, and we can compare one with the other and use that as a basis for new science. This is what these collections are about.
Okay, we have some questions for you. Please, Paula.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks very much for this conference. Not two questions, yes. The first one is, I understand the interaction between plants and soil in natural soils more than in agricultural ones, because in agricultural soils plants are helped in a certain way to live. They don't starve, so they interact less with the soil. And this is the first consideration I want you to ask. How much in agricultural soils in a year cycle the plant can change? First. Second is many years ago in Europe there was the problem of the acid rains. Do you remember the problem of acid rains, which were acidifying soils? And they were measuring the critical loads, so the susceptibility of different soils according to the mineralogy to buffer this acidity. But they solved the problem changing the plants. They changed the plants. Probably in that case, the plants, so they avoided to make pines and they choose other type of trees, for example, which were not acidifying anymore. So I would like to have your opinion about these two questions, agricultural soils and acid rains.
Yeah, agricultural soils is basically the same thing, because the plants that are grown for grain are basically, they have the same physiological properties as those in the prairies. Some parts of those in the prairies. But there's always a very strong interaction. And I remember we wrote a paper with a Chinese student in China, soils in China, and we looked at the potassium and alfalfa soils and things like that. And we saw that it continued to be very high and so forth. And the reviewer said, "That's not possible. Where is the potassium coming from?" Down deep. That is, all plants have most of their roots at the surface, exchange roots. They also have much of the root system, a certain portion that goes deep, and that captures elements that are being produced from the dissolution of primary minerals. It's brought back in, and it gets recycled. But these plants are all functioning the same way. At different efficiencies, they have different restrictions as to what they can accept or not. So if you change the plants, it can adapt better to a certain kind of soil than others. And this has been known by farmers for forever, until 1950. But in the country, I used to talk with farmers out in the country, and they could tell me what field was good for what kind of crop. Because the fields had different geological backgrounds, and the crops were different, but they knew. Because they were scientists. They observe and they draw conclusions. And we think we're the only people that do that. It's not true. No, the only people that don't do that are the people on Wall Street. They never learn. No, but these communities of people who do things, observe, and take note of it, and so forth and so on. This is an extremely important aspect, and I feel that agriculture, for some time now, the farmers have accepted what experts tell them to do. They accept that this should be there, and so forth and so on. They can't say much about it, and they use the advice of these people, but they don't go back to their own observations and all those in the classical past. And this is another thing that could be very useful too. You can't let just anything happen. Of course, they have to have help, but still, it would be probably a better system. Anyway, I thank you very much.
C'est pas de demande, I have, of course, being an old-fashioned mineralogist, I would ask you something about you mentioned that the different soils have different clay minerals. You mean the light stalactite and vermiculite. Do you think that there could be other constraints in the transformation, in the evolution towards one or another type of clays? Only a climatic factor, or also some more links with geology?
For sure, for sure. In France and in Brittany, this thing sticks out here.
That's a wood.
Here, it's all flat, it's all hexagonal, but it's a granitic massif, basically. So one of the earlier railroads in France went from along the Loire Valley to the center of that massif. Why are they building a railroad just to places in the middle of nowhere? Because they brought chalk, calcium carbonate that was burned. They brought the chalk. This changed the pH of the soil and increased the productivity by N. So they were changing the chemistry, they were changing the mineralogy.
Sort of correction of the soil.
It was a correction. Okay. Maybe it is useful. It was a correction, and we can manipulate the clays themselves, sometimes beyond or more rapidly than what the plants can do. But within the range of normal kind of chemical exchange in solutions, what's in the plants, what gets down, what the plants take out, what the buildings of others.
Qualche altra domanda? We thank you once again for your very nice lecture, and please enjoy your stay here. Grazie.